Hello, I'm Marc Newkirk. We're living in quite an amazing time right now of scientific discovery, and I've spent my lifetime on the cutting edge of scientific discovery and technological development and been quite amazed by how much is known nowadays about everything. And we're living in an astonishing time, but also to some extent a perplexing time, where there's a great deal that's known that isn't being communicated yet widely to the public. And my purpose actually is to share some perspective on what's actually happening here right now, in case it's useful to you. We're living in a time when we have amazing synchronicities happening, amazing miraculous things occurring on the planet that are astonishing, at the same time as outrageous behavior, cataclysms. We're hearing about global warming, and the next minute, you know, we're setting a record cold day for a given area. We're living at a time when the magnetic poles are moving around, where there are major changes in the sun, there are major changes on every planet in the solar system. So what's happening? I hope to offer you some perspective that is my own perspective, which when you understand what really is going on here, in my perspective, you end up with a tremendous amount of excitement and inspiration and optimism, actually, about the future and the understanding of what all this is about. So this is about what's happening right now. I am going to offer you a singular perspective. It's just my perspective on what the status is right now of things on the planet. Perspectives on causality, actually what causes what, how everything really works, which is quite different from the prevailing common view and what has been taught generally, but as actually known by an increasing amount of the scientific community that's at the cutting edge of discovery, which has never been farther from the mainstream teaching as it is right now. I also will offer you my perspective on what are the purposes of all this? Why are we here? What's really going on? Also, some perspectives on the history, which in my view is very different of what's actually happened here. What's the history of the solar system? What's the history of the planet? What's the history in recent history as compared with what's been taught, which is very different from that? And a view of the outlook for what's likely to happen in the near term and to some extent in the long term. These are just my perspective. Please exercise discretion and discernment on your own part, as you should always with everything that you hear, and especially these days in the information age, when you can find something that says almost anything you can imagine. And the question isn't, is the truth available? The question is, what is the truth? Because you can find all versions of everything. You need to exercise discernment. Basically, paying attention to what your heart says about what you're receiving and plotting your course accordingly. This experience, in my view, and in many other people's views, is actually a duality, and it is purposely a duality, and you will never find a source which gives you all of the answers purposefully, I would submit. So exercise discernment. If this perspective or parts of it are useful to you, use it. If they're not, feel free to discard it. My perspective is being derived from a variety of sources of meaning to me. I was trained as a remote viewer by a former member of the U.S. military intelligence remote viewing programs. For those of you that don't know what remote viewing is, it was a set of protocols that was developed in the 1970s, originally on government contract by Stanford Research International, now known as SRI International, a spin-off of Stanford University. And it was a set of protocols that, in the perspective of one of the developers, allowed people to transcend time and space and gather information. And in his words, you could take someone with the psychic ability of a bag of hammers, unquote, and teach them to transcend time and space. And those protocols actually have been used by not only the US government but others to gather intelligence about things that you could not seemingly know from any of the information that you had available, but you would go within and get them. That's a discipline that I was trained in and came to be of the viewpoint that in fact all of us have those abilities, and we actually have the capacity at some level of our awareness to access information on literally anything. Some of my viewpoints that I'll offer you came from introspection, the same kind of phenomenon that metaphysicians use, that are just calming their rational self and going from within in meditation and gathering information. I also have had experience pretty much lifelong feeling that I was receiving information, and I believe that all of us receive it. The only question is who's listening, but receiving information from a higher source, which I would say tends to be either, depending upon your viewpoints, your higher self or your angel guides or whatever. But we all have our belief systems, but I believe we all do have information and inspiration that's available to us. I receive information, some of which I think is correct, and the stuff that I believe is not correct, I discard, and encourage you to do the same. Some of the information is from memory, also not only in this experience, but I would submit in prior experiences, and I think that you will find, as some of you are aware of it, many of you may not be, but there's a lot of evidence nowadays that actually we have experiences above and beyond this one, whether it's in dream states or prior lives or however you want to see it. And increasingly, as you connect with more and more of your own inner self, you start to realize that you have memories and awareness of things that have happened that are not of this lifetime experience. Additionally, as I say, we're in the information age where there's been literally an explosion of data off the internet, off the media, etc. We're bombarded continually, newspapers, television media, radio, internet, whatever, Hollywood, with information from all kinds of sources. And the question is, what's correct? And you can, in fact, using protocols like remote viewing and that kind of training, you can determine that truth ends up having a different resonance than information that isn't true. And so some of that data which I'm exposed to, which we're all exposed to, I feel is true and incorporated into these perspectives. Most of it that I come across is not, in my view, true, and I'm not including that. This delivery is being delivered, unlike some of my lectures which talk a great deal about scientific evidence. This delivery is not really about proof. You can go and you can find proof from my lectures and other things on the internet and elsewhere, but I'll be talking about things which in many cases are proven, in some cases are not proven, but I believe to be true. And I'm delivering this perspective to you without any attachment as to whether anybody agrees with me or doesn't agree with me. That's fine. I'm not attached to that. So those are the basis of the perspectives that I'll offer you. As I say, use it if it's useful to you, any of it, and discard it if it isn't. One of the things which has materially increased my own view of perspectives that I'm offering you is the use of a technology called light field. Here you're actually seeing a unit that's based in hyperdimensional physics that is essentially a set of training wheels. When people go through this unit, the unit opens up, they walk up the stairs, they lie down, it closes up, they're in this unit for 30-40 minutes at a time. It's sort of a set of training wheels in which they begin to connect with more and more of their innate awareness. And I've been through that unit more than 260 times through a predecessor technology that did the same kind of things but at a lower level more than 100 times. And those have had, in my view, a tremendous effect on my ability to gain information from my inner self. And this is a unit which is unique in the world. It's located in Chester, Massachusetts at a charitable foundation called Lightfield Foundation. Basically, I think we're living in the most amazing time in the history of this planet for a lot of reasons that will become apparent. In this particular time, it would seem that nothing is as it seems. that there's been so much distortion of information that has been propagated to the public from various sources, both intentionally and unintentionally. A great deal of what lies behind all of what's happening right now has not been shared with the public. Basically, as you look around you, pretty much nothing is as it seems. But it is an amazing time where the truth of what's actually happening, how things work, what's possible, what's happening at fundamental levels, that's finally being revealed in this time is more astonishing than fiction. And it's very, very exciting and encouraging. And I hope by the end of this lecture that you will at least have been offered a perspective which is very much more hopeful and optimistic perhaps than you might have come into this discourse. What's happening fundamentally right now on this planet is a great awakening. People are awakening planet-wide right now. People don't wake up when they're comfortable. They wake up when they're uncomfortable. When they're comfortable, they are content with being asleep, basically, at whatever level of awareness they have. But when they become uncomfortable, they start questioning things and they start looking for answers. And that's what's happening now. Planet-wide, people have become very uncomfortable. That's, on the one hand, creating a lot of drama, which is causing a lot of concern to people, but in confusion. Things like absolutely outrageous behavior going on is causing people concern. Things at the same time that are virtually miraculous that are happening. Synchronicities that people have never seen before, behaviors people have never seen before that are positive are also being noticed. And the question is, what's happening? And there's a great awakening occurring right now, which is very encouraging for causing change on the planet in the direction of what's needed for greater harmony. Historically, the mainstream scientific teaching, as you'll probably recognize by all of these statements, is that the material world is the only reality. That seems to have been for a long time the mainstream scientific view that's being taught by nearly every higher educational institution on the planet. We've been taught by mainstream science generally that we've been created by happenstance, that we're just kind of an accident that happened, and mutations and biological activity and chemical activity, that we're separate and alone, that each of us is just our physical bodies and it has no connection in particular with anything else, that we may be the most intelligent and advanced life form in a finite universe, that we're born into existence and eventually die and cease to exist. That was historically the mainstream scientific teaching. Today, on the cutting edge of science and discovery, there's a whole different view by the scientists at that level as they discover all kinds of things that are at odds with every one of these statements. The emerging awareness of many on the planet is that the true reality is that there is a spiritual existence and that we actually are spiritual beings. I'm not going to get into evidence in this lecture, but I have other lectures, and many other people do, of scientific discoveries that are pointing to that reality. That true reality is spiritual, that we're ageless and eternal spiritual beings that are having a series of human experiences. And there's evidence for all this in some of my other lectures and elsewhere. And there's an emerging awareness also that we're actually experiencing what amounts to a series of plays comprising space and time. The plays are not reality, but they're learning experiences in which no one is ever harmed. People tend to come to that awareness as they pass from this experience. And as I say, there's also scientific evidence of what people are experiencing when they've passed, because many of them actually have come back when they were pronounced clinically dead, no brain waves, no heartbeat, and been revived by medical science or some seemingly miraculous synchronicity. 18% of them actually remember what they were perceiving as going on while they were clinically dead. Of those that remember what was going on while they were clinically dead, they typically are feeling, oh my gosh, that was a dream or that was a play. I've never been harmed. I'm just fine now. And so is everybody else when they leave that. So this is the reality, namely the spiritual reality, and that was the play. Emerging awareness, I wouldn't say it constitutes the awareness of the majority of the planet at this point, but there are a lot of people that now believe that that's the case, and many of them very justifiably because of an awareness of scientific data that's showing that. We tend to, as we acquire increasing wisdom, initially before we're really aware of what's going on, we think they're the characters in this play. We think the play's reality, we think that we're the characters. Then as we start to wake up, we realize, oh my gosh, it's a play. It's not something that has no significance. It's not something that you can just ignore, because this seeming play will come up and smack you in the nose pretty fast if you think you can just ignore it. But we start to realize we're actually not these characters in the play. We're actors in the play. And then eventually, as we learn more, we start to realize, oh my gosh, we're not just the actors in the play, we're the writers of the play. That is actually how we progress as we develop increasing wisdom about how it all works from all of the broad data and understanding that's now coming into the world from a whole wide variety of sources, evidence and inspiration that's becoming increasingly available. And there are more and more people starting to come to that worldview. If that's true, how does it all work? How is all of this possible? How can this be a play? Where does the mechanism come from by which we participate in all of that? Without wanting to get into any kind of an endorsement of organized religion of any kind, which I don't wish to influence anybody's viewpoint on anything in that regard, I will tell you that my perspective from a scientific point of view, based upon the evidence that I see, is that in fact there is an all-creative source. And I think there's evidence of that, but in the process of explaining to you how I think it all works, I will tell you I think there's an all-creative source. That all-creative source is comprised of qualities and properties, not stuff, nothing physical. For example, qualities such as intelligence, such as life, such as love, truth, spirit, existence itself, principles, and has properties of omniscience, meaning it knows everything, this all-creative source. Omnipresence, which means that omniscience, that all awareness, is ever present, is everywhere. And omnipotence, meaning that it's all-powerful. Well, classical philosophy has many times attempted to debunk those concepts when you couple them with the idea that there's a creative source and it's good. Basically, it's taking the position that, well, there can't be an all-creative source that's omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent that's good, because if it were omniscient, it would know of everything that's happening, and it would know there's evil in the world. And if it's omnipresent, it would be everywhere, so that there would be nowhere that it wasn't aware of this evil in the world. And if it was omnipotent and it was good, it obviously would seek to eliminate evil in the world. And because there's evil in the world, and we can all see it and we all know it, therefore those things can't be true. Either there's an all-creative source that's all of those things but isn't good, or isn't necessarily good, or it's one or more of those properties isn't true. Well, actually, I would submit that in the proper perspective, and we'll get back to this, that conflict does not exist, because actually in a higher view of what's really going on, because this, quote, evil that we're experiencing is simply an experience in a play, and no one's ever harmed, there's no such thing as evil. There's such a thing as experience. But if in fact no one's ever harmed, clearly there can't be any judgment that this is somehow good or bad, because they're never harmed. If they're never harmed, then what does that have as a purpose? We'll get into that in a while. Fundamentally, intelligence creates thoughts. And the biggest discovery of modern time, in my view, is, and I would submit to you, it's actually a rediscovery, but for all practical purposes in our time, it's the initial discovery, because we tend to not be aware of what actually has happened in the past here. But I would say the biggest discovery of our time is that thought creates a field. Mainstream science has taught us that thought is simply an electrochemical brain phenomenon, and that's all it is. It's a very, very weak electromagnetic physiological effect. It has been proven and discovered and is being utilized in technologies today and forms the basis of the ability to understand what's really going on here, when you understand that when you create a thought, or when anyone creates a thought, or when the creator, if there is one, creates a thought, it creates a field. Thought-created fields are essentially non-physical fields. They're not made of matter, they have no energy content, and they're comprised purely of ideas or information. If you think of these thought-created fields as an idea field or an information field, you're starting to get more of the picture that I'm trying to offer you in terms of how this all works. If you think about information itself, literally the abstract idea of any particular information, it doesn't live anywhere in particular, irrespective of time and space. These are ideas, concepts, etc. The thought that's new here is that these thoughts, when they're created, they create a field. A field is something which creates influence at a distance. We'll go into how that works. Basically, creation itself, I would submit to you, and this is quite at odds with mainstream physics teaching. It's not necessarily at odds with quantum physics teaching, but I would tell you that creation itself manifests from an infinite field of light. That field of light is essentially the sum of all possibilities existing at once. There is such a field of light, and creation is manifested from that. Existence is comprised of reality and constructs. The reality comprises both the creator and the creation, which are in fact spiritual and changeless. That is reality, and as I've indicated, the spiritual reality is comprised of qualities, concepts, ideas, principles. They're all non-physical, they're all changeless and eternal. They're spiritual qualities, if you will. The constructs, in fact, are the theaters, essentially, in the system that generates experience. The constructs are all finite, they're all evolving, they're not changeless. They're based upon spiritual ideas and principles and all of those, but they are themselves changing and finite, and they comprise things like universes, galaxies, star systems, planetary systems, moons, asteroids, comets, plasmas. All of physicality is part of the constructs. The so-called dimensions and densities of existence, which I'll go into further shortly to define what that really means, they're all constructs. They all comprise operating systems that essentially define what works and is possible in a given locale, in a given universe, in a given system, etc. That's fundamentally how existence is categorized. In reality, changeless and eternal, and constructs which are finite and evolving. All of creation itself is composed of light. That concept of light is quite different from what is classically taught, but basically creation is made out of light, to the extent of our experience of it. And it is discontinuous. All of the constructs, in fact, wink into and out of existence. In this particular realm, they wink into and out of existence at something called Planck's angular frequency, which is about 10 to the 43rd times a second, which is like of the order of 1,000,000 trillion times a second. It's essentially not always there as a construct, but it looks like it's always there because it's being manifested in and out of existence according to a probability function that's related to consciousness. But basically it's discontinuous, which means it's not always there. In fact, there's no such thing as motion in these so-called constructs. We think there is. We look at motion all the time, but our physical equipment that we're able to perceive it with is operating so slowly relative to the frequency at which it is being recreated and remanifested continually that it looks like it's always there. There is no motion. What actually occurs is that if you take, let's say, a ball and I throw it to you and you catch it, the ball that you're catching isn't the ball that I threw. The ball that I held initially has a property of a location variable that's unique in space and time to its manifestation when I'm holding it. The one that you're catching has a different location variable, and it's manifested into and out of existence many times in the process of going to me to you, from me to you, and you perceive it, we perceive it as motion. There is no motion. Light doesn't move. There is no speed of light. Light just is. And all of physicality, all of experience in the various realms of constructs are manifested into and out of existence. Not always at that same frequency, it depends upon the operating system, but in the realm that we're in, it's called winking into and out of existence at that angular frequency, Planck's angular frequency. The nature of creation itself, as I say, is physical. It is comprised of ideas and not energy and matter. The manifestations of it, which are in the constructs, are physical or can be physical. All of creation is also metaphorical. It all has meaning. It all has symbolism and significance in terms of what you're looking at. It all symbolizes qualities and concepts that all have meaning. We don't always notice. As a matter of fact, most of us are almost totally oblivious to the metaphor of what we're looking at. But it has, in terms of intelligence, it is based upon intelligence and has metaphorical significance. That's true of our bodies, that's true of everything we look at. That's true of the entire experience in any realm. Well, these are sort of radical ideas that I've been throwing out here. Let's talk about some of quantum physics, which is well known at this point, although still not widely understood and accepted by the masses, so to speak, or even by mainstream science. It's sort of an anomaly out there that people think, oh, well, it's quantum physics just applies it, at a very tiny level that we don't completely understand and can ignore for the most part when we're thinking about what's really going on. Well, in fact, that's not true. I would submit to you, quantum physics in terms of certain principles applies at every level, large, small, etc. And it is not anomalous with regard to experience. It's just, for the most part, people don't really understand how this is working. Let's talk about the nature of matter. What does quantum physics talk about in the nature of matter? I've said spiritual reality is non-physical. This is a quote from Max Planck in 1944 during World War II, taking place at the time he was in Florence, Italy. He said, "There is no matter as such. All matter originates and exists only by virtue of a force which brings the particles of an atom to vibration and holds this most minute solar system of the atom together. We must assume behind this force the existence of a conscious and intelligent mind." That's actually quite consistent with what I've been talking about here. Most people are unaware of that quote. It's become very popular nowadays to talk about quantum this and quantum that, and most people don't realize that the founder of quantum physics, Max Planck, would tell you that matter actually doesn't exist in the sense that it's solid and real and all of that. It's an experience. It's not actually a thing as we think of it. Let's take another famous scientist, Albert Einstein, who says reality is merely an illusion. He's really talking about what I'm referring to as the constructs. But he says reality is merely illusion, albeit a very persistent one. I love that quote. Dean Radin, the chief scientist for the Institute of Noetic Sciences, made the comment, "History shows that as the scientific frontiers continue to expand, the supernatural evolves into paranormal. and then into normal. So he's saying the paranormal is normal, and the supernatural is actually normal. So, consciousness gives rise, as we said, to thoughts, and thoughts give rise to experience. They do so by virtue of a field. Former Soviet Union scientists concluded that the 5 classical fields of physics, which supposedly give rise to all experience and all matter and energy and all of those things, were in concept incomplete, that there was a 6th fundamental field that is necessary to explain what all's going on. A field, as I would remind you, is something that creates an influence at a distance from the source. Various degrees of influence at times for the classical fields, depending upon how far you are from the source. The source has less and less influence as you move away from it. In the 5 classical fields, it's exponentially smaller as you move away from the source in its influence on something else. And the 5 classical fields, which we're taught actually give rise to everything, are the electric fields, magnetic fields, gravitational fields, and strong and weak nuclear attraction fields. The Soviet scientists concluded that there's a 6th fundamental type of field. They called it torsion field. I think a better way of expressing it, and this is shared by a number of physicists, a more descriptive term of those fields is information fields. It also is the case that if you go on the internet and you look up things like torsion fields, you'll find a great deal of disinformation that isn't actually correct, along with correct information. And partly for that reason as well, that there's been a conscious attempt to hide, in essence, this discovery and significance of torsion fields because it's so powerful. There's a lot of disinformation out there, and you'll tend to get more correct information from the concept of information fields than torsion fields. Information fields were a 6th fundamental field, which by the 1980s, the Soviet cutting-edge scientists realized there was a 6th fundamental field necessary to explain many anomalies and many phenomena which they were proving to be real in the former Soviet Union, and also were being proven to be real elsewhere in the scientific community. But for the most part, the Western scientific community, mainstream, was ignoring the discoveries of the reality of a lot of phenomena that were inconsistent with any explanation by just the existence of the 5 fields. The 6th fundamental field, information fields or thought fields, those fields actually, as it turns out, are very fundamental, more fundamental than the other 5, and give rise to all of the other 5 and everything that we ever experience. Well, I said there's a light field, this light field that essentially constitutes all possibilities of everything, every experience and everything existing at once, and that light field has a property of being pervasive. That is, it runs through everything, all of the cosmos, all universes, all galaxies, all expressions of any kind of reality in terms of the constructs. So you might imagine, well, here's what the light field would look like if it's all possibilities existing at once, all frequencies of light, for example, if you're envisioning it as physical light, it might look like this, namely just whiteness, whiteness everywhere. Well, in fact, because it's pervasive, because the light field has a property of balance and symmetry, it looks the same everywhere. Because it looks the same everywhere, and because all ability to detect anything with any kind of a detector detects by virtue of comparison of differences between what's within the detector and what's outside the detector, basically you have no capacity to perceive the light field itself. It has a property of symmetry, so it's the same everywhere, and it runs through everything. And so if you look at the light field itself, it looks like this. Blackness, nothingness. And in fact, if you look at space, you would conclude that most of this universe, for example, is nothingness. It's a vacuum. There's nothing there. Actually, there is something there. There's something everywhere. It's this light field that's pervasive. What, in fact, you are seeing as, for example, this NASA Hubble telescope picture of this universe looking out into the galaxy and the stars looks like this. What you're seeing is somethings occasionally and space in between, which is just blackness and nothingness. The space in between that is so-called nothingness isn't nothing, it's everythingness. What you are looking at that's comprising stars and planets and plasmas and comets and all of that, those are essentially texture in that light field. They are essentially differences in that particular location that exist in between those locations with other things that you're perceiving. And in between is the blackness that is in fact brilliant lightness, but has a property of symmetry so that you can't detect that. There is somethingness everywhere. What actually causes the manifestation of somethingness are thought fields or information fields interacting with this light field to create texture, which are the expressions of reality that we experience in a given construct, whether it be a star or a planet or a person or whatever. Those constitute essentially texture in this light field. And the analogy would be, imagine you're above the ocean, way out in the ocean on a clear day, looking down, and there's no wind and it's a deep ocean. At that point you look down and it looks like there's nothing there because there's no texture, there's no contrast, there's nothing to compare it with. And now a breeze comes up and it creates waves on the surface and say, oh, there's the ocean. That would be the analogy. The breeze are the information fields. The ocean is, in that analogy, the light field that's pervasive, and when information fields interact with that light field, they create texture, and that's what we then perceive as the, quote, experience or the reality or the component of reality. So that's the analogy. So when you're looking at space through the Hubble telescope, you're looking at texture in that infinite light field that has been generated by idea fields or information fields that comprise the information that actually manifests all of that detail, whether it be a sun or a planet or a person or an atom within that so-called light field. I mentioned before that this light field has a property of symmetry. An illustration of the concept might be shown here, in which you're looking at a mountain and trees and sky, and there's a mirror reflection of it. Basically, the light field that has this property of symmetry everywhere always maintains its symmetry. It's always symmetrical and everywhere. But from a given view of a given construct, say a space-time construct, when you manifest something in a space-time construct, it will essentially manifest some texture in that field that you're perceiving from the space-time construct. Simultaneously, it will manifest the mirror image of it, as you see illustrated in this picture. This is just a picture of the mountains and the lake, but the concept is that there's a reciprocal reality. This is a time-space construct that is created in order to maintain the symmetry of the light field. So there's a whole separate mirror image reality, so to speak, or experience occurring in time-space when there's one in space-time. So that's basically the way it works. Who are we? We are each unique individual ideas. The reality of who we are is changeless and eternal. It's spiritual. It's concepts. It's qualities. It's ideas. And each of us is a unique individual set of ideas. We are omnidimensional, meaning, and I'll get back shortly to what my definition of dimensions is, but essentially there are many dimensions of existence and we are in all of them. There are aspects of us that are in all of them, and I'll talk more about that shortly. We have essentially multiple levels of awareness. When we're in a particular construct, such as the third dimensional Earth, for example, as a theater of experience. We have a level of awareness which is operating within that construct, within that theater, that to the first order and initially believes that it's the only awareness because it essentially isolates itself from the other awarenesses in other realities and other constructs. But we in fact have awareness in all realities, and we are omnidimensional. We are way more amazing than any of us yet even realizes. But we're progressively learning more and more of our true self and our true identity as we gain experience and wisdom. As we're gaining experience, we're seeing more and more evidence that we really have multiple levels of awareness. Eventually, as we understand more and more of that, and when we allow it and when we are experienced accordingly, we learn that at our highest level of awareness, we're literally omniscient. We know everything. Remote viewing was a protocol that was discovered in the 70s that actually proved that reality, that actually all information lies within us and is potentially accessible when we reconnect with that level of our awareness. So, at our highest level of awareness, we're actually part of a single consciousness. And as we become more and more aware, we become more and more expanded in our awareness that we are part of something greater and greater and greater and greater in terms of awareness, until at our highest level we realize that we're omniscient. All of the information is available to us, and there's only one consciousness at that level. Since there's only one consciousness in the entire cosmos at that level, obviously that consciousness, if it's the consciousness of everything, obviously it knows everything, and that level of our consciousness is omniscient. This sounds like speculation, but actually the entire existence of remote viewing as a phenomenon which you can study on your own, or you can listen to explanation of it in some of my other lectures, is actually proven fact. We experience creation in a context of constructs. And the constructs are, as I say, essentially theaters based upon different frequency bands and different operating systems, depending upon what level of the theater and what area of the theater you're operating in. There's a theater of experience that is created as a given construct. An example of the theater would be the Earth in this particular time, operating in this particular location here, having an experience. That's a theater. Within those theaters, we can isolate levels of our awareness within a given theater so that we are focused within that so-called construct which we believe at the time is the only reality, and we are isolating our awareness from the other levels of our experiences in other theaters and other realities. There are within a theater different frequency bands that are operating simultaneously, and there are different operating systems governing experience in different segments of a given theater. The operating system, for example, in our solar system is different than the operating system in some of the other solar systems, meaning practically there are things that are possible here that are not possible other places. There are things that are possible on this planet that are not possible on other planets, or there are things on other planets in our solar system that are not possible here, because the operating systems differ. So it's quite a sophisticated array of possibilities of experience that exist within even a given theater, let alone a given universe or a galaxy or the whole cosmos, which comprises many universes. The constructs are comprised of a variety of dimensions and densities depending upon the particular universe. For example, this universe is comprised of 12 dimensions and includes 12 different densities. The bars on the left-hand side of this slide are intended to show how much of the inclusion of different densities is incorporated in a given dimension. The dimensions shown as D here in the bars, 12D, 11D, etc. And the bars on the left-hand side of this chart are the dimensions. For example, if you go all the way to the left in the 12th dimension, it comprises 12 different densities. And over on the right-hand side of the chart, there's a description of the different densities. Essentially, a dimension is comprised of different frequency bands that go from a lower frequency to progressively higher frequencies, and they're bands of frequencies of perception. And the consciousnesses that comprise the experience in a given dimension vary depending upon the first dimension, which is only one density of consciousness. That density of consciousness constitutes the consciousness of atoms, molecules, bacteria, and viruses, for example. So in the first dimension, there is only one density of consciousness, and that density of consciousness is the consciousness, as I say, of those items. An atom has a consciousness. Actually, it turns out everything has a consciousness. Everything is conscious. And an atom has a consciousness of a given frequency range. Same thing with a molecule, bacteria, viruses. In the second dimension, for example, the second dimension of this universe comprises a consciousness frequency band of plants in the lower animal kingdoms. Their consciousness operates in a given frequency band that is higher than the frequency band of atoms, molecules, bacteria, and viruses. To an atom, a plant just looks like another array of atoms. It doesn't experience the plants and the animals as different than itself. It experiences them as all being comprised of atoms and molecules and bacteria and viruses, because that's the frequency band it's perceiving in. A plant perceives everything as plants and the lower animal kingdoms and all of that. It does not typically experience humans, for example, as being fundamentally different from itself in terms of consciousness level. It perceives it as being a similar consciousness to itself. As you move up through different dimensions, you have more and more frequency bands of conscious experience occurring within that given dimension. The dimensions of this universe are essentially co-located in the respect that they're all operating here in this universe, but the higher dimensional experiences and the densities that are comprising those are aware of what's below them, but are not typically aware of what's above them in terms of the ability to see what's happening in that frequency band. If you could raise your frequency, for example, in third dimensional Earth to a level of perception that was higher than the third dimension, you would essentially see a different reality come in to experience right around you everywhere. That is the fourth density consciousness level that is oblivious to a third density consciousness. But in fourth density, you can perceive both the fourth density consciousness level and the levels that are below it in third density, second density, first density. The fourth density consciousness can perceive what's going on in atoms and molecules and bacteria, and that it's a different frequency band, but still within the same fourth dimension as plants and lower animals, humans and higher animal kingdom in the third density. As you move up from the third density up through the 12th density, you see human consciousnesses occurring there, but they are progressively constituting higher and higher frequency bands. And so what happens in the fourth density, for example, you have higher frequency bands of humans comprising fourth density consciousness in the fourth dimension, and even higher frequency band human consciousnesses experiencing the fifth density. When you get to the sixth density, they start forming what are called social memory complexes, in which humans start sharing the consciousness of other humans, so that all of their knowledge and all of their experiences, past and present, are available to all of them. So you see exponentially higher and higher consciousness As you move up through the different density levels in larger and larger social memory complexes, starting with the 6th density up through the 12th, in which equivalently, doesn't quite work this way, but equivalently in terms of quantity, you might imagine that a 5th density consciousness would be the highest frequency range of an individual consciousness operating solely by itself on this planet. But a 6th density consciousness might be one that is now formed, a mind meld, if you will, where all of the information available to an entire planet load is being shared. It doesn't necessarily divide by planets, but conceptually you might have the equivalent of 6 billion or 7 billion consciousnesses all sharing information as compared with one. So you can see that as you're moving up, and let's say the conceptual analogy might be a whole solar system versus consciousnesses all sharing information, or a whole galaxy, etc., or a whole universe. When you get up to the 12th density, basically all consciousness is being shared in terms of awareness by everything there, and those are omniscient beings because it's the consciousness of everything. So that's kind of a conceptual model of the densities and dimensions that are present here in this universe. Our experience in this lifetime has been essentially, until recently, simply a 3rd dimensional bandwidth, if you will, of consciousness that we've been operating in, where we think that that's it, you know, just whatever we're able to perceive at that level. As you move to higher and higher frequency bands, you come to realize there are other realities and other information that's available. Generally, as I've indicated, anything within a given dimension is perceivable by the density levels above that dimension. So interestingly, if you're operating in the 3rd dimension and you think you can hide something, you may be able to hide something from somebody in the 3rd dimension, where people are typically not expressing conscious telepathy. They are experiencing telepathy, but their waking consciousness typically is not aware of it. They might think they can fool people, they can hide things, but in the 4th density, to the 1st order, everybody can see everything. And so they're not hiding anything from people in the 4th density. Those people are typically fully telepathic, and they are able to see virtually everything in the 3rd, 2nd, 1st densities as part of their dimension. So it's sort of humorous, actually, in that way, that we in the 3rd density think we can hide things. We don't hide them from anybody in higher density levels. There is a polarity consciousness that prevails up through the 5th dimension of this universe, meaning that within the 5th dimension and those densities and 4th and 3rd densities, everything seems to be polarity conscious. There's good and bad, there's good and evil, all of that kind of thing. Above the 5th dimension, things are not perceived that way. They're just perceived as experiences, events, etc. They all have a purpose. Everybody knows at that level nobody's being harmed in these realities, in these reality experiences, and they know that they all have a purpose. Not only are things which appear to be good having a purpose, but things appearing to be bad from an experiential point of view are teaching us things, we're learning, we're becoming wiser, etc. And nobody's ever being harmed in these constructs. So at those higher levels, there's no polarity consciousness. We don't think of things when we're in that consciousness level, 6th dimension is up, as being good and bad. They just are. They're experiences that have a purpose, because nobody's harmed in those experiences. So the conflict between good and evil, essentially, that classical philosophy regards as proving that there can't be an omniscient and good and omnipotent and omnipresent being, that's false, because in fact at those kind of levels nothing is perceived as being bad, because it's just an experience. Just like going to a Hollywood movie, if you went to a movie that had a lot of violence in it, it's just a movie. It's an experience. It might prove something, or you might feel certain emotions, you might learn something for it, and you might gain something out of it, but it's just a construct, just an experience. as I say, good and evil are viewed as higher and lower frequency ideas in the higher realms. Everything in creation is actually an evolving, conscious living system, whether it be an atom or the earth or a person or whatever. Everything is rising in consciousness over time. Here you're looking at a graphic showing the earth in its information fields. Information fields are toroidal in shape and they circulate, and the earth has a toroidal information field that surrounds it. It also has another component, which you're seeing here is a vertical shaft, which is metaphorically showing its connection to the higher dimensions up through the 12th dimension, showing the connection of its consciousness. And that toroidal field is circulating. It's a field of information which causes and sustains the manifestation of the planet altogether. It comprises essentially life force. It's a non-physical field. It's a complex field of information that is changing over time and controlling the evolution of the Earth itself and its planetary behavior. It's essentially a program, if you will, of information that causes its manifestation and sustains it. All living things have an information field associated with their physical manifestation and actually cause and maintain the sustenance of their existence as a construct. The Earth currently, in our experience, has 3 different dimensional experiences occurring amongst the present human population. They tend to vary geographically at this time. There are some parts of the Earth today that you can go to where the experience is 3rd dimensional, and you're beginning to be able to find places on the Earth geographically in which the experience is increasingly from the 4th dimensional bandwidth. There also are, in a few cases, 5th dimensional bandwidth areas that can be experienced by the higher frequency elements of the current human population. Those are varying with time. Many of the higher frequency bandwidths were not visible to almost anybody in the human population a short time ago. They're now starting to be essentially different operating systems, different degrees of harmony as compared with the disharmony that's experienced in so much of the 3rd dimensional experience. If you think about your experience, if you're viewing this video, you're increasingly experiencing more and more of the 4th density consciousness. You're approaching the higher range of the 3rd density consciousness, which starts to have elements of the 4th density bandwidth. I say that because actually information fields, the information field that surrounds and sustains your physical presence, which looks toroidal like the Earth's field, those fields have a property of like attracts like and opposites repel, which is the opposite of electric fields and magnetic fields, where opposites attract and like repels. In the information fields, they have a property of non-locality, so actually, unlike the other fields, since they have no local boundaries, imagine an idea. How can an idea have a local boundary? It's just an idea. Those concepts that comprise information fields have a property of non-locality, and they have a property of like attracts like, which means that like-minded people are attracted to each other across space and time in what would appear to be a series of synchronicities, but in fact is just physics. Like attracts like. Like-minded people are attracted to each other. Similarly, in these different geographical experiences that are starting to take place increasingly in different parts of the Earth, the higher frequency consciousnesses are being attracted to safe havens on this planet, which are operating increasingly in the 4th density, and the lower frequency consciousnesses are being attracted to similar frequency bands. And so you have the lower frequency consciousnesses being attracted to some of the greater degrees of drama, so to speak, negative drama on the planet, where they're experiencing warfare and they're in famines and earthquakes and all of those kind of things. So as the consciousness of individuals are rising, and as the consciousness of the planet is rising, there increasingly is a polarization of consciousnesses within the geographic locations in which, while you may be aware of what's going on in the other frequency bands, those aren't your experience. For example, if you're viewing this video, I would say to you that if you look at your own experience, your experience is far more harmonious than some of the experiences on the planet. For example, we're all aware there are wartime experiences, there are earthquakes, there are catastrophes occurring on the planet, but they're not our personal experience. We're experiencing something different, a higher degree of harmony. And we're aware of the lower frequency band in those experiences in different geographic parts, but we're not attracted to being there. We don't have our home being ripped in half by a tornado or being bombed into oblivion. We're experiencing something different, a higher frequency range. Why do we actually incarnate physically? Basically, we are spiritual beings. We're non-physical. We can choose to incarnate and take physical form and be born into theater such as we have here on Earth right now that we're experiencing. Why do we do that? Especially since we're spiritual beings having a human experience, and obviously eventually we move back out of this experience. Why are we doing this? The first answer would be, I would submit, that it gives us an ability to experience contrast, which creates spiritual growth. We're experiencing things which are causing us to become wiser at lower levels of our segregated consciousness that is having different experiences in different frequency bands. The lower levels of our consciousness are experiencing both positive and negative experiences, which cause us to develop wisdom and cause us to appreciate more the higher frequency ranges. For example, if you're a person who has never experienced anything but love ever, you really don't comprehend how magnificent that really is to the degree that you would if in fact you've experienced the lack of love. So you have people incarnating and choosing experiences, for example, where a person wants to develop a feeling of greater compassion and decides to go be a poor person in a given lifetime, for example. Well, if you maintain your awareness of the fact that you are a spiritual being and you're not poor, effectively you have all things and all that, it would be like, imagine a billionaire who wants to experience poverty in order to develop more compassion. If he goes and lives with the poor people but remembers that he's got $1 billion bank account, he's not experiencing what they're experiencing. But if he checks his memory at the door, so to speak, and comes in and experiences being poor the same way that they experience it, as though that was reality, he develops a greater deal of compassion for that kind of thing and a greater degree of appreciation for his $1 billion bank account when he's not in that consciousness experience. So experiencing contrast to develop greater spiritual appreciation and experiencing relationships in a different way than you can experience if you're not in physical form, and experiencing the limitations in this particular realm of what's possible, what isn't possible, and what kind of behaviors people get. Those things all create greater wisdom, greater contrast, and greater appreciation. And basically we have our lower fragments of our consciousness that are indigenous to the lower frequency bands having been created there, developing more wisdom and evolving to a higher level over time to appreciate ourselves and others to a greater level. Physical incarnation, spiritual beings fundamentally are non-physical. But if they choose physical incarnation, they can choose different realms to incarnate into. There are a plethora of different realms, different frequency levels, and different operating systems in different locations that are available. And basically, a soul who decides they want to physically incarnate is essentially offered opportunities to inhabit different realms and different time frames. Physical incarnation is available in different realms, and you are basically offered positions in different realms. The Earth is a living system, for example. You will not find that just anybody can come here and be here just because they feel it would be a nice place to be. The Earth itself has its needs and its purposes in its own evolution, and basically offers to individuals the opportunity to incarnate here because it fits the individual's needs and it fits the needs of the other individuals incarnating at the same time and the planet itself. So there are different realms that are offered, and there are such a plethora of possible realms that it's always possible to find what it is you want to experience that. The incarnation actually is experienced as coming through the stars. There are portals through those stars to bring their non-physical selves into a given realm. As I say, it requires permission to enter a given venue. The same thing is actually true of space travel, contrary to the classical view that you just go out and stick your flag in a planet somewhere and it's yours. Actually, there are living beings and life, including the planet itself, almost everywhere, so you have to be invited. You can't just go claim it. The candidate is offered these different alternatives. There are different technologies allowing viewing of probable paths if you do incarnate there, and the outcomes are never assured. You have free will once you get there. You're just shown the probabilities, the probable path of a given incarnation before you do it. But once you're in here, it's an adventure and you do have free will, and the outcomes may be different in your experience.